Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. In this episode, we find out about GraphQL, and here to talk to us today is Vladimir Novick. Vladimir is a developer advocate for Hasura.io, a Google developer expert, a consultant, a worldwide speaker, a published author, and he is the host of the 3-Factor Radio podcast. As well, he also contributes regularly to open source software. Vladimir brings years of experience within the JavaScript ecosystem with him, and he's been coding since the rise of the web, from the time of Netscape Navigator and the first browser wars. So he's definitely a battle-hardened veteran. Currently, he works with web, mobile, VR, AR, and IoT technologies. Vladimir is also an advocate for the use of what we're here to talk about today, GraphQL and serverless architectures. So welcome to The Cynical Developer, Vladimir.
Hi. Thanks for having me here. It's quite an epic introduction, thanks.
Not a problem. It's a long list of achievements, and similar to myself, probably a little bit more than... but you've probably been serving a little bit longer than I have, but you've been there with the browser wars and done a little bit of everything.
Yeah, like browser wars and age of Netscape Navigator, that definitely sounds like an epic thing, right? But I mean, that's when I started to kind of get into the web and everything. So that, yeah.
Sure. I think I came in at around about IE5, so a little bit later than yourself, but definitely saw some of those browser wars and things. And we come out the other side, and people complain about it now that it's which JavaScript framework do I use? Don't be concerned about that. It's what browser do you use?
Well, back in the day, it was like, which language do you use? I remember a conversation with my dad or whether VBScript or JavaScript will win the war, and I'm pretty happy. I won this. Because my dad was betting on VBScript because like VBA back in the day was really a thing.
Yeah. And
I was saying JavaScript will win, and here we are.
Yeah, and I think for all the bad press that JavaScript gets, I think we're in a better place than if VBScript had shone through.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. So today we're here not to compare war wounds, but to talk about GraphQL. So we'll kick it off straight from the top with, what is GraphQL?
Yeah, so some people confuse GraphQL with lots of things, actually, because there is a graph MQL, right? And people say, okay, something to build graphs with, right? Or like query language like SQL, something like that. And it's none of those. Basically, GraphQL is kind of query language for your APIs. So you can think about it as like a new way to get your data from the server or from literally anywhere. And the idea is instead of having REST APIs, have with like several endpoints and with versioning, with a bunch of problems which we'll probably discuss in this episode later on. With GraphQL, you basically have one endpoint that you query, and the shape of your query, like you have specific query language, the shape of data that you ask from the server is the exact same shape that will be returned back from the server, which is pretty nice. And it means on the client, you have the power to decide what data you will get from the server. Okay.
So yeah, I think the name is quite confusing for people with the word graph in there.
Yeah.
And I think when I first saw it, I thought, it's another charting library or something like that.
Yeah, the name is definitely confusing, and actually, I will share the link later on. But a month ago, I did a pretty long, like 4 days bootcamp on GraphQL. So we obviously will discuss GraphQL here during podcast. But if our listeners wanna check this bootcamp, it's a free one. It's on YouTube. around like 10 hours of live coding. You can definitely check that.
Awesome. We shall put the links in the show notes. That'd be really good. So, GraphQL, is this a library that I can just use with my preferred technology? Is it just a standard, or do I have to use it with a certain technology?
It's more of a standard. It was introduced back in the day and actually used internally by Facebook, and then introduced to the community. And the idea is, I mentioned before that you query with specific syntax, you query your endpoint on the server and you get the data, right?
Yep.
So the idea is you write GraphQL on the server and you write GraphQL on the client. And it means on the server, you define how your resources are typed. You define types of your resources. You define so-called resolvers that will return the specific data. And basically, you can think about that. You sort of configure a schema on the server, like a data schema, right?
Sure.
And when you configure that on the server, on the client, you have the power to use specific libraries. You have the power to query this endpoint and get this data based on connections between these types. So you can use on the client by using libraries such as Apollo client, for example, or you can just send a post request with a specific form. It's a post request, one endpoint, and inside it has data with query field, having stringified GraphQL syntax, and variables field, which will include a bunch of variables that you want to pass through to the server. So typically it's several things. It's creating your server, which you can do in various technologies, and consuming this API from the client, which like the best practice will be to use Apollo client for that.
Okay, so it seems like it's a very different approach to this sort of thing that we're used to dealing with. Back when we were looking at XML services, or even now with REST services, we would request a certain thing just by the query string, and it would return a known schema. But with this, we can sort of mold and model our own models that are returned, I guess.
It's sort of like on the client, you're having a power of getting any data that you need as soon as the schema of how this data will be resolved or brought from resources is defined on the server. So you can think about that as a backend developer creating the server once, and then front-end developer can create anything from that because he can literally query any type of data. So in a sense, you won't need to define new endpoints as you defined with REST. You don't deal with lots of problems that REST has, which we'll discuss in a bit, and basically gives you an ability to query literally anything from the server.
Sure. So I guess it's somewhat similar to writing a SQL statement against a database, and you defining what you want to bring back.
Sort of, but it's kind of dangerous comparison because of QL and people confusing that for connecting to the database.
Sure.
So it's sort of writing a query in specific format on the client and getting the data from API on the server. So it's in no way direct connection to a database, because some people sometimes confuse it for that. But it's like a query language for API.
Okay. So we just talked about that there, that it's not a direct connection to the database. So I can use this with any database or data store technology then?
Yeah, and that's not only with any database. You can basically define that you, let's say, have REST APIs, several REST APIs for some external services. You can create a server that will wrap this REST API and will resolve all this data according to some kind of schema, some kind of types, right? And whenever you will query this data from the client, the result that you will get back will be a consolidation of all of these resources. So it can be from literally any resource, database, any REST APIs, literally anything.
Nice. So that's a real powerful point there, that you can put this in front of an existing API. So are there any other benefits to using GraphQL rather than using what we would traditionally use, such as REST?
Yeah, REST initially it's a good idea, right? So the idea of REST is having an endpoint for every resource, which is a good thing, right? Like we have, it feels logical. We can cache these resources, but then there are lots of problems with that, like for example, overfetching or underfetching. And I will elaborate. Like overfetching, for example, is consider a blog CMS.
Yep.
And you want to get the list of posts in your for a blog, and every post has a user. So typically the data structure will be for every post table there will be some kind of user ID, and this user ID will be a foreign key for users table, right?
Yep.
So on the database side. So our API endpoints will probably look pretty much similar. We have, let's say, /post/ ID number of this post. And then this post will have the result that we'll get back will have some kind of user ID. Now, what if we want to get this user name and like profile picture and stuff like that? Probably then we need to query another time. Like we need to query user endpoint and send another request. So what we'll get several requests. And this is underfetching because we don't get the data that we need. We need to do another request and another request. And consider you have like 20 posts and for to display on the page. And for every post, you need to create a user, like to write the author, write the username. So for every 20 posts, you will do another request. So meaning you have already 21 requests to getting just the simple data.
Yeah.
So typically REST will solve it by having this user data already in posts result, right?
Sure.
But when creating this endpoint, you won't know what exact results the client will need. So you probably will put username and address and email and literally everything that a client may need. So this is overfetching. I'm getting more data than I supposed to, which is bad for mobile traffic. It's generally bad because then you need to kind of sync all of these on the client. Now GraphQL solves it in really simple manner. When you query something, you will get the exact same shape of data that you asked for. So there is no way to get more data than I asked for, or there is no way to get less data than I asked for. It's the exact same shape. And that's really powerful thing. Because, for example, the REST is solved sometimes with some caching mechanisms and with lots of additional stuff. With GraphQL, people typically ask, okay, what about caching? Sometimes caching is not needed as it's needed in REST because it simply doesn't have all of these problems. Now, this is like several problems. Other that GraphQL solve. Others are, let's say, versioning. You don't need to version things in GraphQL. You can simply deprecate field, and it will get like the client will get notification that something is deprecated. Now, additional powerful thing in GraphQL. Remember the fact when you, for example, create a REST API. Consider like you create a REST API, or someone on the backend team create REST API, and then you don't have documentation for that. So you need to dig into the code and search like what this will return, or just try things out in Postman. Now GraphQL, because its nature of having a schema, it has graphical ID. That's like the web-based ID that every GraphQL server has this thing. And inside the browser, you will see auto-generated docs for your GraphQL, meaning you don't need to write your docs. They will be just simply auto-generated for you. And it doesn't matter which GraphQL server you will use, you will have this type of thing because it's like a standard. Right, so there is, in a nutshell, like several things that are better over REST.
Yep.
And obviously there are much more. I covered several of them also in my bootcamp, so you're welcome to check it there because it can be several hours of just describing benefits of GraphQL.
Yeah, sure. So it's got a lot of really good points there. Automatic document generation, the data coming back. If you deprecate anything, it tells you it's deprecated. So is that always sent as a post then off to GraphQL, or is it taken care of by the library that you're using, and you don't really care how that communication happens?
You need to send a post the post request. That's how it's defined. Like all GraphQL requests are sent as post request with query field and variables fields. And that's because the nature of like query language, it can have variables, it can have reusable blocks called fragments, can have lots of pretty neat things.
Sure. This might be a very stupid question, but I know it's called GraphQL, so Graph Query Language. Can you update data as well as query it?
So the thing is, I'm talking about queries, right? But GraphQL has three really important concepts. It has queries, mutations, and subscriptions. And it's really good you bring in this question here because it's really important to understand. So for queries, obviously it's querying data and getting it back is like read-only thing. Changing data is done through mutations. So whenever you send a mutation, and you still send it in query variable in post request, but the syntax will be a little bit different. Instead of query keyword, it will have mutation keyword. And you pass variables that you want to change. And on the server, instead of like for the query, it, for example, goes through resolvers to resolve the data. For mutation, it still goes through resolvers, but not to resolve the data, but to update the data. So you can do whatever you want with that. You can update the data store. You can change anything, like insert new things. You can just send emails for that. So basically anything that is an operation is done through mutations, like operation, like a write operation, or a sort of a side effect, not just reading from the server. And subscriptions is a really cool concept. Subscription is for getting connection to backend through WebSockets, and basically subscribing for changes. So whenever any change is happening on the server, then this change is propagated to the client from the server back. So no polling mechanism, just pushing it through WebSockets back to the client.
Nice. I quite like that. It's definitely a lot more advanced than your standard REST API.
Yeah, but it may seem really complex, but whenever you get the hang of the query language itself and the concepts how it operates, it's sometimes it's even simpler than create REST APIs.
Sure. So, is there a monetary cost to running GraphQL? Do I need to pay for licensing, or is this just some open source software I can install on my server and just get cracking with it?
Yeah, so I mean, no, GraphQL is not a software. It's just a standard, right?
Okay.
So how there are lots of libraries that implement GraphQL on the server, or on the client. Basically, on the client, you can just use post request and pass everything. Or you can use open source projects such as Apollo client, for example, and just query the data, mutate the data, subscribe to data. On the server, there are various options. You can write things your own. You can use various like tooling for creating your servers. You can create use like auto-generated GraphQL, which is basically the what Hasura is all about. Like the Hasura, the company I working, what they have auto-generated GraphQL API. So all this complexity that you need to write on the server, so the client will be able to query it or mutate. You basically don't need to do that with Hasura, because it can run. It's an engine that can run on top of existing Postgres database, and it will auto-generate GraphQL API for you.
Okay.
So it's free and open source. Also, it doesn't have any monitor cost for that. So you can just use it out of the box and run it either on new database or on existing one, which is pretty neat. And that's
awesome. So,
answers.
As well as being able to install it on your own machine or your own server, Hasura is offered as a PaaS, as a platform as a service as well. Is that correct?
Basically, it's an open source engine, so the installation of on your own server is done by the developer itself. The idea is it runs in Docker containers, so it can run literally anywhere. So if you compare to like other solutions out there, I think this is the only solution that can run anywhere on literally any platform. Such as, for example, you want to install Hasura on AWS, you can easily do that. You can install it on Azure, on DigitalOcean, and even locally, like on your Docker running on your local machine, you can have the engine. And let's say you can have a production database somewhere. You can have a Docker container on your local machine. You just run this container on that existing database, and we'll get everything auto-generated for you.
Awesome. So it's all about the developer making the choice about whatever cloud formation or whatever hosting platform they're using. Hasura has a way of providing its service to that developer, no matter where they are.
Yeah, it's basically getting this engine up and running on any of hosted platforms. And actually, in the documentation, if you visit hasura.io, you will see, like, even on the main page, you will see like deploy on Heroku as like simple setup of get going and see how it behaves. But you will see a bunch of other platforms, and it will like the links will lead to the docs explaining how exactly to install on each platform.
Nice. That's really good. So I think anybody out there that's maybe thinking about putting in GraphQL, that from what you've said is that it's really simple. It's not a case of if you're currently doing REST that you've got to now drop that and move over to GraphQL. You can keep your REST services going and get GraphQL to consume your REST service and build it up from there.
So with the REST service is a little bit different. It's kind of process to go through, right?
Yep.
So the thing is, it depends. It depends which database you have. So for example, if you have REST API and you have let's say Postgres database, then you can easily run Hasura on top of your Postgres, getting auto-generated GraphQL for CRUD, and having your REST API working. But to wrap your existing REST API with all the business logic and stuff like that, you obviously need to do some manual tweaking here and there. Now, the cool part, Hasura has these two things called remote schemas and event triggers, which basically it kind of follows a new architectural pattern. It's called three-factor app architecture, and opposing like regular like microservices, let's say, architectural pattern, it means that three-factor app has three important things. It has real-time GraphQL, meaning GraphQL API with subscriptions. That's for real-time. It has a venting system, and it has async serverless. And it means that all your business logic, for example, that you want to do, you can write your own GraphQL server, use remote schema, and Hasura will stitch this schema inside the auto-generated one. Meaning you can use your own business logic, let's say in a synchronous way. And the serverless part is you can do this in a synchronous way. Whenever there is some change to a database, there is an event trigger that is fired, and you can connect that to a serverless function that will do a bunch of logic. So I know like it's lots of really complex terms to comprehend. So I will share a bunch of links also to go through and see like how everything is done. I wrote a bunch of blog posts detailing all of these things. But the idea is if you need to wrap REST API, you will obviously have some kind of your own GraphQL server that will wrap your REST API. And this will be passed as remote schema to your Hasura and wrapped with and stitched together with your CRUD API. I hope it makes sense in
yeah, it does. And I think it's probably just a slightly different way of thinking about communication with your API and how the setup is done. Different to what we're used to, but that's how these things progress. That's how we get better solutions for it. So it's always nice to come across a slightly different way to attack a problem. And GraphQL seems pretty cool. And the fact that you can define the schema that comes back is really, really a good selling point. I think, especially you touched on earlier that you don't want to return all the data for mobile, so you can cut that down. But you could return a lot more data for web, whereas in the past, using REST, you would probably create bespoke endpoints for mobile, bespoke endpoints for web, bespoke endpoints for your IoT devices, and it becomes a lot more development work. Where this is sort of a build your API once and run it everywhere.
Now the cool part about Hasura is like even not build your API once, is just run the engine. It will build the API for you. I mean, it's like simplified, obviously, like what I'm saying. Obviously, you will need some kind of business logic, so you will need to add your own like consideration of how the data is passed through. But like in a nutshell, that's what it is. And also, Hasura provides you with a bunch of authentication options. You can use it with any authentication provider out there. And it has really nice permission model that you can even have user permissions up to really granular level, to the level of columns in your database. So you can say return any data, like literally everything from my database except this column, and it will simply work.
Sure. So it's secure straight out of the box as well.
Yeah, that's right.
And sort of on a similar note to that, does it provide throttling as well to stop people from spidering your data or abusing the API?
Yeah, obviously, if you have some kind of like authentication, then it will be really hard to abuse the API, right? So if you have, you need to pass a bunch of JWT, you need to pass JWT token, you need to pass custom claims if you use, for example, if you use AWS Cognito, right? So you need to configure that for your Cognito to use custom claim and pass it down to Hasura. So a little bit configuration here and there, but obviously, whenever you use tokens, this is a secure way of doing that. So people won't abuse your API. But even for development purposes, let's say you want to develop your app without any like complex authentication, right? So you want to create some kind of demo app, or you want to, I don't know, like experiment on things. It has an option to add some kind of admin secret key that will secure your API endpoint. Obviously, it's not secured enough if you don't use proper authentication, like Auth0, Firebase Auth, AWS, Azure, you name it. Your custom auth, but it gives you kind of an ability to use your API in development and not letting people to abuse that.
Sure. There's quite a lot to take in there for what GraphQL is. You've already mentioned that you've got a bootcamp course out on YouTube, which we'll put a link to in the show notes. Are there any other resources that you could suggest for listeners to go and look at?
Yeah, definitely. So because Hasura is it's an open source, there are lots actually it's a huge community around Hasura, and a bunch of people created lots of sample apps and community resources to just check and GitHub repo. So there are a bunch of boilerplate sample apps and use cases, as well as blog posts on Hasura. And on a weekly basis, me and my colleagues, we do live streaming on Twitch every Thursday. So these streams are also available on my YouTube channel, and whenever I stream, or on Hasura YouTube channel. So all of these is out there, and I will share a bunch of links, so you can put this in description. In addition to that, sometimes I do these kind of boot camps. I speak at lots of conferences about Hasura, and also do kind of workshops before. So if you just see me at some conference, just feel free to just reach out and ask questions. And in addition to that, there is a Discord server for Hasura with a bunch of community channels. Whenever you can just jump in, ask questions, not only related to Hasura, but just related to GraphQL. Just that we have a channel called New to GraphQL. So for anyone who is just starting using it, we just help people out there. And we also share a bunch of resources there. So these are good things to check.
Yeah, that's awesome. Knowing that there is a community already there around a technology that you're wanting to try, or you're thinking about trying, I think it drops that barrier to entry a bit. So that is fantastic.
Yeah, that's definitely it. I mean, GraphQL and serverless, this is, you were right saying about all of these is like different ways of thinking. So it's really important to pass this knowledge to community and let people understand how you need to structure your app, how you need to architect them, and what actually benefits of doing that. Because after all, we are trying to make better apps. Whether it's web, mobile, AR, VR, anything. And GraphQL and serverless really help us with doing that. In addition to that, apps grow larger and scaling become a thing, and serverless can really help on that part, as well as GraphQL.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, that just leaves me to say thank you for coming on the show today and talking to us about GraphQL and Hasura.
Thanks a lot for having me, and it was really nice discussion. And I guess see you on Twitter and on any social media.
Yeah, definitely. And everyone out there, that if you got any questions for Vladimir, then do jump on to Twitter and give him a poke. Jump on the comments for the show notes as well, and I'm sure he will get back to you. But until next time, thank you for listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Slurop, and you've been listening to Vladimir Novick talking about GraphQL and Hasura. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.